Hey everyone, Clio here, and it's finally time for my best books of 2020. It's a video everybody in BookTube always looks forward to because it's just so much fun to be able to gush about all of your favorite reads throughout the year. It's also just fun for yourself to be able to kind of look back on the year and figure out, what are the standouts for this year. And for me this year it was actually somewhat more difficult because last year I really had like two clear standouts, two books that I was like, one of these is my favorite book for 2020. And I think this year I don't have an absolute favorite, or I cannot with certainty at this point in time say what my favorite book this year would have been. So I did need to look at the list a little bit more carefully to figure out which ones I was going to put on here. And I will say that this list it's a moment in time. Next week I might put some other books on here over a couple of others because there were definitely, it was a deep field, I have not read as many books as I read this year in any other year. I had about 66 books that I've given 4 stars or higher to, which is the range that I look for in my best books of the year. So I had so many books to kind of figure out which one to put on there that I'm definitely sure that over time some others might win out over some of these in this list. Like, it was very easy to decide on like my first 6 books or something that I wanted to include in this video, but the last 4 or something was definitely more difficult to figure out which ones I was choosing over some other ones. And so in that sense it's a moment in time. Maybe if I had to redo this in a month's time I would pick some others for those final 4 spots than I would at this point in time. But so yeah, I read so many books this year, and for my best books of 2020 I usually look at the like 4 to 5 star range, because a lot of times my favorite books might only get 4 stars right after I finish them, because there are certain flaws to the book that I take into account. But over time it is a type of book that sticks with me, that I keep on remembering, that I keep on thinking about, and so that I rate higher over time than I do at the point in time in which I've read it. So those books might not have been 5-star reads, but they do stick with me longer, and so they are favorite reads. But so without further ado, let's just dive into this list, and hopefully I have something interesting to say about these books, because a lot of times it ends up being the case that you absolutely love a book and you cannot really put that into words, but I'm hoping to be able to in this video. But so in random order, there is no particular order to this list. I'm going to talk about the first one that I have here, which would be Saga. So this is a comic book series by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples that I'm dying for a sequel to. So basically they put out 9 volumes already within this story arc, and that's basically sort of the midway point of the story. We will get 9 more volumes, and they were supposed to be on a 1-year hiatus, but that 1 year is over, and so maybe they're working on it already, but I haven't heard anything. But so I caught up to this series in its entirety this year, because whenever I finished one I just wanted to dive into the next one because they are so good. And this one definitely is a bit difficult for me to explain why it is so good, but that's partly as well, I guess, because I don't have a lot of experience with comic book series. But so basically it's a Romeo and Juliet retelling in which we're looking at these 2 characters from differing races, and their races are actually in a war against one another. They actually meet in a sort of war setting because the male character Marcus is imprisoned by our female character, and so she falls in love with him, and then they escape together and form a family together. However, people don't want to see that. They don't want to see that these 2 differing races can live together in peace and harmony, and so they have to go on a run in order to be able to safeguard the future of their daughter. I will say, if you try to read this one, the first book is very introductory. So after the first volume I wasn't blown away, and I was kind of like meh about the whole thing, but I definitely did find elements of it intriguing enough to dive further into the next volume, and that's when I fell in love. And every single one after that, except for one maybe, I gave 5 stars to, because it was just such a fun experience to go through. I absolutely loved the ride, and it was just like super fast paced. I went through it immediately. It was such entertainment. It was such a fun read. And so, but it's not just all fun and all engagement. It's not just that it has a super compelling plot line that you want to follow along with, it also has these interesting characters, and it dives into these interesting topics. It definitely dives into like some harder topics within a comic book series, and the way it handles those to me felt very wholesome. So we also have, for example, a storyline about grief at some point within this comic book series, a comic storyline about abortion, and all of those are handled in a way that to me at least felt very right. And so I liked how this is a comic book series that has this sort of like graphic style to it in parts, because there is definitely some sort of like graphic sex scenes with this character, which is a sort of like spider-esque bounty hunter character, and so there's definitely graphic scenes for it. It's not a comic book series that is suitable for young children, for example. There's a lot of graphic violence scenes and things like that in it as well. It also deals a lot with like sort of PTSD, because our main character Marcus, who was in this army, definitely has a lot of bad experiences about the experiences he had when he was a soldier, and he is very much a pacifist at this point in time and doesn't want to take up arms anymore, doesn't want anybody to get hurt. And there's just so many great things about this story. There are also a lot of diverse representation. We definitely have LGBTQIA plus representation. We have some characters that are like, they are of mixed races within this world, but we also have lighter skins and darker skins. We have a transgender character that makes its way into the story at some point. And so I absolutely loved both the fun and the fun entertainment side of this book as the deeper subject matter that it went into, which is something that always works very well for me. If it's only pure fun and entertainment, then I dismiss it as being mediocre. But if it has some sort of a layering of either, you know, character exploration or bigger world problems, then I'm down for it. Second book I have on my pile was quite a surprise for me, because it's a book that I hear rave about by people who have a very different reading taste than me. So a lot of times when a lot of books that they recommend that I've read, for example, I've dismissed for that reason that I referred to earlier, that they were pure entertainment and there wasn't much more for me to dive into with those ones. And so when it came to this book, it was recommended by some of those people, and you know, with those, then I was like, yeah, their excitement got me excited. I was intrigued about the premise. I did want to try out the author for once, but I also absolutely loved the book. And so that just shows that, you know, there's always overlap in this. It isn't because a lot of cases you don't like the books that that person likes that you won't like a single book that that person likes. And so it also showed to me that I have quite a lot of prejudice when it comes to YA contemporary, which comes from my current problems with YA fantasy. But actually I'm finding myself liking quite a lot of YA contemporaries that I've tried, especially hard-hitting YA contemporary, something that apparently really sticks with me. And so the book that I'm talking about is Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo, and I definitely want to try out more by Elizabeth Acevedo because I absolutely loved the style. So it's a novel written in verse, and you actually have audiobooks that are narrated by the author herself, which I absolutely recommend. So I listened to it while going along with it in its physical form. As you can see, I tapped quite heavily because there was just such richness to the language to start with, but there was also such deep subject matter to the book as well. So in this one, we're basically looking at these two girls, and they share a father. So they have the same father, they don't have the same mother. And so one of them lives with her father and her mother in New York City. They live their regular life. However, 1 month a year, her father disappears to the Dominican Republic on business trips, but basically what he does then is he goes to visit his other daughter and her mother. And so this is basically the situation at the beginning of this book. Neither girl is aware of the other. And so when their father goes to the Dominican Republic that year, his plane crashes. And so this book is very much about dealing with the grief of losing their father, of course. And so looking at the two different ways in which these two girls grieve. It's very much looking at heritage, cultural heritage, because we have both this girl who is heavily involved in Dominican culture and who's looking at Dominican culture and the way in which the West is interfering with the Dominican Republic. And so we're seeing her and the way in which she's looking at that type of development, but also the way in which it has created this whole system of people looking for attractive girls to go and work in the resorts in order for rich Western guys, rich American guys, to go there and abuse them. And so we're looking at that from her perspective, for example, but we're also very much looking at this other character, this girl who has been brought up in New York all of her life and who has been brought up with some Dominican heritage, but who never really feels like she is Dominican because she has never been to that place. She has never really been there, so how can she feel Dominican if she hasn't really seen that country, for example? And so through her it dives into the complexity of emigration and, you know, of second generation cultural identity. So I very much love that aspect to it. Apart from that, we're also looking at, you know, the difficulty of being a young girl in our world. So both of these have situations in which they have to fear male figures around them, and I absolutely loved going into that subject matter because it's something that I think every woman can relate to. We've definitely all had experiences in our lives where we've had to walk down a dark lane, for example, and have seen a guy on the other side of the street, and we've been wary at the very least of that person and been hyper aware of this other person walking the streets with us because we are all aware of what often happens to girls walking streets alone. And so I very much loved that exploration of the novel as well. Apart from that, these girls are just so fleshed out. It really were two completely different characters, two completely different voices, and both of these characters were given such a rich background experience and such a rich identity that they really felt so separate from one another, and they had these sort of like passions that it was so interesting delving into and you know, learning about the characters through their passions, through their fears, through their anxiety, and I loved it. It's amazing. So apart from having this deeper layering, apart from it being a story about grief and about finding your way back to lost family, about this difficult start to a relationship between these two girls who are both drawn to one another because they are each other's sisters, but at the same time they also represent the reality of their father having lied to them most of their lives. So it's an interesting dynamic there. But apart from all of that, it has that enrichment of the language, the beautiful language in which this story is told. So I definitely want to read more by Elizabeth Acevedo after this one. Diving into a completely different read, we have The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin, or in general, the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. I'm picking up The Stone Sky for this one because this is the one that sealed the deal for me. Up until I finished The Stone Sky, I wasn't on the fence about the Broken Earth trilogy. I definitely highly respected what it was doing and thought it was super interesting and that everybody who loves fantasy should be at least trying it out because it is so different from other fantasy that I've read. But this one really brought it together for me, and this one definitely pushed it above that, you know, I like it, I love it, you should read it point into a, oh, it's amazing point. So in the Broken Earth trilogy, we are looking at a Earth that has been shattered, that has been broken. We are basically looking at an Earth that has these sort of extinction seasons. And at this point in time, we are at the final season, the 5th season. It is said to be the final one. It's said to be the point in which Earth will no longer be able to recover. And as a result, because of all of these different seasons that have taken place, this world is a very harsh, a very hard place, and its people have a lot of prejudices against others, and in particular they have prejudices against origins. So origins are people who have power over the elements. They actually have the power to control earthquakes, for example, so they could be of huge use. However, the people, like they basically have to hide their powers all the time, or otherwise they are in huge danger of being slaughtered by the people in their village. And so we look at this sort of structure that has originated in defense of them, in protection of them, but that's actually kind of slavery system that is using that is controlling these origins, and that is kind of sharpening them to become tools, taking all of their personality and all of their individuality out of them and only using them for their powers. And so the story, plot-wise, I won't go into much of the story, but so we're mainly looking at this character of Esun, who at the very beginning of this book, she has been living undercover. Basically, she has been living with a still, as it's called, a normal person who doesn't have any sort of power. She has 2 children by him. She's kind of hiding the fact that they also have these powers from him. But when she returns home one day, her husband has killed her son and has taken her daughter away. So starts the story. It's an amazing one. It's so complex and difficult. So For the first book especially, you're definitely going to feel confusion throughout the vast majority of this story, and it's definitely a feeling that remains for a very long time throughout the series. And so in that sense, I always say that it's not a good one to start with if you have no experience with fantasy, for example. But if you've read a lot of fantasy, this is the perfect one because it's very different from what you might have read before. And actually throughout the series, it will become clear that it's actually more sci-fantasy. It has a lot of sci-fi elements to it as well, especially this third one. Definitely hyper focuses on the science part of it, and throughout the series you're definitely exploring a lot more of the reality of this book. You're putting things together and you're having to figure out this world for yourself, but the third one offers some answers, people. So if you're very confused and you're like, what is happening, I don't really know what is happening, know that it still pays out. I still very much enjoyed the first two books, even though I was confused for the majority of them. But so yeah, in this third one, everything kind of comes together. You get a lot of the answers, you get a lot of the information about, you know, the prejudices that exist in this world. There's a lot of discussion about race, about slavery, about the invention of race to suit the needs of others, to rule over others. So I mean, I thought it was amazing. I absolutely loved it. It's got a little bit more like, it's got characters that's a little bit more difficult to love because they are harshened and hardened by their circumstances, but you know, I definitely did root for them throughout, and I'm absolutely blown away by this series, and you should definitely give this one a go, and you should definitely all try it out. Every single book in this series won the Hugo Award in consecutive years, so that's an achievement in itself, and it's definitely well deserved. Moving on to something quite different, but it also has a sci-fi element, and that would be Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. So this is a general fiction novel with a sci-fi twist. It is originally Japanese, and the second one was translated into English this year actually, so it's quite a recent release. But so in Before the Coffee Gets Cold, there's this cafe somewhere in Tokyo where you can travel back in time if you sit at a specific spot and you order a specific coffee, and then you can travel back in time. You can even travel to the future, but you have to return before the coffee gets cold, or otherwise you become a ghost. Now, no matter what you do in the past or the future, it doesn't really have an impact on present day circumstances. So that begs the question, why would you travel back into the future or the past? And so that's why I say that it's actually a general fiction with a sci-fi twist, because the focus is definitely more on the human experience, it's definitely more on the individual stories of these people and of the reasons that they have for going back into the past and the healing process that they need to go through in order to find acceptance of what has happened in their past. It is told through short stories in principle, so basically it's told through 4 stories of 4 different people who will travel back in time or to the future, and so you could read it as a short story collection. You can also read it as a story in a whole. The rules of the time travel story are always explained again, so that's kind of cool if you read it in one go, that you have to read those rules in every single story again, but I didn't necessarily. It was kind of annoying, but it was also not a big problem neither. But I just absolutely loved this, and I actually loved the sequel more than I loved the first one. No, I absolutely loved the first one, but the second one was amazing, and it made me reevaluate the first one, because we get information that has an impact on the way we read what is happening in the first one, the way in which we read the whole scene of this time travel story and the whole relationship between certain essential characters within this storyline, as well as I cried 3 times when reading the sequel. I don't think I cried when I read the first one, so I mean, yeah, I absolutely love this one, and I will definitely be on the lookout for more by this author, though I do fear that he's only written these 2 books, and so I'll probably be in for quite a wait. Next up we get another hard-hitting read, and that is A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. So this is a beautiful story all about a boy having to deal with very difficult circumstances, because our protagonist in this story is like a 10-year-old boy, maybe something like that, and his mother has been diagnosed with cancer, and so it's about him having to come to terms with those emotions, with the feelings that he's feeling about these circumstances, with the anger he's feeling about those circumstances, all with the backdrop of his mother having to go to hospital quite often, and the people in his surrounding trying to shelter him as much as possible from the reality of what is happening. It is beautifully told, it is beautifully illustrated as well. It's got this very dark and gloomy atmosphere to its illustrations. So, you know, you have these types of illustrations, but they suit the story so well. So I think there is also an unillustrated version of this, so I would highly recommend you picking up the illustrated version if you're going to be reading this one. But so yeah, it was just beautiful, and I think it's super helpful for young children who have to deal with a difficult situation like that, for example. But regardless of whether it applies to your circumstances or not, I think there's so much to explore in here and so much to love in this one. I won't go too much into this because I do definitely think that it merits from you exploring it on your own. There's not too much that I can say about this one that doesn't dive into some sort of a, like, not really spoiler, but to some of the joy of discovering what the story is all about yourself. Next up, another fantasy, and how could I make a best books of the year video without mentioning Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. So my most anticipated read for this year definitely came true. It's not my new favorite Stormlight Archive book, but I definitely enjoyed it a whole lot. And that's possibly also because it just focuses a whole lot on a character that I absolutely love. But so I won't necessarily go particularly into this one, as it is the fourth book in the series. I will link my spoiler-free review up there in case you are interested, in case you want specifics about this book in particular. But so Stormlight Archive is just an amazing series, and what I absolutely love about Brandon Sanderson's writing is it is a combination of plot focus and character focus. I do think that based on reviews that I see from plot-focused readers, they do have more problems getting into his books because they do tend to build up the characters quite a lot in the beginning, and then the plot part of his story writing definitely picks up as we have established base with these different characters. As a character-focused reader, I don't really have problems with the pacing of his books, but do know that if you're somebody who needs like a fast-moving plot, do know that his books definitely speed up towards the latter half of them. But so what I absolutely love about his works is definitely his focus on character and the way in which he can always surprise me. He always has these grand notions and conceptions that go into his books that are at the background of his magic systems, and so I always love that aspect of it. I always love his character development, especially in this one. We're definitely looking a lot into mental illness representation. So one of my favorite characters within the Stormlight is Kaladin, who is somebody who definitely suffers from depression and who definitely suffers from seasonal depression, which is definitely highlighted within the first one, where every time that the weather goes kind of gloomy, he himself also becomes gloomy. And so at the beginning of Stormlight Archive 1, he is actually, through circumstances, become a slave. And so it deals a whole lot with this person who has these grand ideals, who very much lives to support others, who very much lives as a sort of leader figure, and who gets a lot of his energy out of helping others progress, out of helping others get better circumstances for themselves. And we see this character having to struggle with his circumstances, with being enslaved, with no longer having his troop of people, and with having been betrayed, with trying to break out, but really as a consequence creating these harsh situations for the people around him. And so I won't go too much into the plot of this book because there's just too many characters, there's too much of a plot, but definitely know that if you like a big epic plot with some very beautiful character work, then you can definitely find it in this one. And because there are so many different and diverse characters within this one, you'll probably find some character or another that you're drawn into. Now in the fourth one, actually, I absolutely love the journey we go on with the character of Kaladin, because we kind of upset his storyline to the best way possible. It's kind of a case where you kind of hate the author for doing it at the beginning of the book, but you do grow to respect it and grow to love the direction he takes the character in from there on out. I also very much loved some of the characters that he kind of redeems, not necessarily redeems, but this sort of characters that are on the sidelines, that you have grown accustomed to being on the sidelines, and how he puts them in the center spot of this storyline, of this particular book. And that really made me fall in love with some characters who up until that point I've just been kind of indifferent about, and so it made me very excited about their future within the Stormlight. And apart from that, this book is very much Cosmere heavy. So if you don't know, Brandon Sanderson writes a lot of his book within a Cosmere, which is a sort of universe that he has created for those books. And so there are all of these connections between those different books. And Stormlight Archive has had its connections up until this point. It has had the world hopper Hoyt, who we have in almost all of his books. It has had a few connections of other world hoppers that you have been able to pick up on. But apart from that, considering its length, it's been relatively low on Cosmere connections This one is so heavy on the cosmic connections. There's so many links to other worlds within this book. There's so much active discussion of the Cosmere as a whole, whereas up until this point, the Cosmere in every single book has been sort of this sort of you know it and so you see it type of thing, where you're like, I wonder whether this is a cosmic connection. In this one, a lot of those connections are really blatantly pointed out to you, which brings a lot of interesting information into the world and makes you really excited about the future of this Stormlight Archive series. Another favorite book for the year, I was kind of debating this one, but it's just a book that has stuck with me too much for me not to mention it, is Invisible Women by Criado-Pérez. This is a non-fiction novel all about how there's such a data bias against women in our world, how there's so much information out there, but how a lot of data and statistics information that we have is actually not divided between men and women, and so we don't really have information about how certain things might be different for men than they are for women. And so she looks at different aspects of our lives in which this can be of interest. For example, let's look at transportation. The fact that the statistics about the way in which our transport system has been set up is very traditionally male-oriented, because it very much looks at the idea of you leave your house in the morning, you go to work, you work there for a couple of hours, then you go from work back to your home, and that is it. However, for women, the reality is often very different, because women, they often drop the kids off at school, then they go to their workplace, they work for a couple of hours, then they might go and pick up their kids, but they might also go to the grocery shop first. They might go pick up their kids but drop them off somewhere else, then they go home. So all of our transportation, our public transportation net, which is underfunded in general and is used more by women than it's used by men, our transportation network is build up with the idea that you go from the center and you go out and you go back, but you don't go like around the center, for example. So that is just one aspect that it's looking at. Another thing that definitely has stuck with me a whole lot after reading this book is medicine, is how a lot of trials, a lot of research into medication, a lot of trials with medication actually actively seeks to keep out women out of the research, because we women have hormones and we have a cycle, and so that means that it's very difficult to take us into account, because why can't we just be simple and straightforward like men in that sense? Because our hormonal balance will have some sort of an effect on medications, and so the scientific model of how to examine a product's use or a product's effectiveness is not built with the idea of women and the different hormone balances throughout the month in mind. And so basically there is almost no research being done into female products, and so basically as a result a lot of things work less well for women as they do for men, because statistically they're mostly tested on men and they don't really care about the fact that it might not work as well for women as it does for men, which is also why there's not enough research going into women-specific problems, for example. So yeah, I found it very interesting. I've thought about this so many times since I read it. I will say that I think that it's suffers from quite a lot of structural problems, and so I would have liked to see a lot more statistics, for example, introduced into it. When she's talking about certain elements, pictures might have been useful to kind of explore the differences, because sometimes, for example, she's talking about product development and, you know, the size of an iPhone, for example, in a man's hand versus a woman's hand, so pictures could have been helpful as well there, just to kind of make it more digestible, because now you just have a full text and it sometimes becomes quite circular, because she's building up that same argument in every single chapter, the argument that there isn't enough information out there about the female experience. And, you know, apart from in the introduction, she doesn't even go into the lack of information about people of lower socioeconomical status, about people of different races, about people of minority groups. And so, I mean, I thought it was just so interesting, and I've thought about it so many times, but it does definitely have its structural problems. And so I would say that, you know, don't expect it to be a perfect read or anything like that. I'm so excited about this book, and I'm including it because it has just opened my eyes so much. And so many articles that I read about certain things now, for example, when I read about, you know, the difference in the diagnosis age of autism in girls versus autism in boys, that immediately brings me back to this particular subject. Next up, we have Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. I was so pleasantly surprised with this one, and I was so in love with this book at the end of it. So for a very long time I thought this is going to be my favorite read of the year. It's definitely up there in my best 5 or 6 or something like that, but I cannot decide for any of these books whether it's my favorite book or not, but definitely no, it's up there. It was amazing. So this is a book in which we're looking at this young girl called Queenie. She is black, she's living in the UK, and so she's kind of struggling at the beginning of the book, let's say. She has a lot of like one-night stands, and she's also not really getting too much out of them. She's kind of in this self-destructive spiral where she allows all of these casual relationships with men, even though a lot of times the sex is actually painful between them, and even though a lot of times these men don't treat her well, they actually kind of fetishize her for her looks. So she isn't really getting a whole lot out of it. She often makes very bad decisions when it comes to men as well, where she will then also be dating one of her co-workers, for example, and entering into a very destructive relationship with one of her co-workers. At the same time, she's kind of disillusioned with her work. She's a journalist and she was kind of expecting to bring Black Lives Matter subject matter more to the forefront. However, she's not really getting the assignments that she's very interested by, that she's very passionate about. However, we also see throughout this book how she's not really taking her work seriously neither. She's very much always chatting to her co-workers when she's at work. She doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot of work when she's there. She's often talking to them about her love life, about the relationships she's had, so she's also very distracted by her personal life when she's at the workplace. She's very much somebody who doesn't really seem to have her act in place, and this is very much a therapy positive book, because she is of Dominican heritage and apparently in Dominican culture, but it's definitely also something that I could say about Belgian culture, for example. They very much have it's very much a little bit taboo to talk about therapy. It's definitely not as harsh as it's portrayed within this book in Belgian culture, for example. But I do definitely think that there is still this taboo around therapy and about needing therapy, and that you individually definitely also feel like it's a big step to take the step to seek out help, because even though everybody accepts the fact that therapy helps, there's still this sort of stigma about the fact that you need therapy to begin with. And so in her family, definitely there's a big response when she seeks out help, when she seeks out when she goes to therapy. And I definitely loved the therapy within this book. I loved how therapy positive was, the message that it portrayed about therapy. And you know, I absolutely grew to love Queenie so much throughout this book. She's one of those characters that makes so many mistakes, that makes so many bad decisions, but that you just keep on rooting for and hoping that she can bring her life in order, because she is such a charismatic person that you absolutely do fall in love with. So yeah, this was a great book, and I wasn't expecting it going into it. You know, in 2020 there's been a lot of discussion about Black Lives Matter and about more representation, and a lot of things that people were calling out for was the need to also represent Black joy. And even though she is very much at odds with herself, struggling with herself and with what she wants in life and with the choices that she's making, I do ultimately think that it is a book about Black joy, and I absolutely loved it, in case it wasn't clear yet. Next one that I'm going to talk about is The Seventh Perfection by Daniel Polansky. So this is a fantasy book. It's kind of a mystery fantasy because it is relatively short. It's kind of like a novella. I think it's under 200 pages even. But so it's basically about this person who's a sort of like inquisitor type person who has reached the seventh perfection. So she has like perfect memory, perfect eyesight, or things like that, all of those things. And she is going on a quest to find answers to some questions that she has. But we only hear the answers, basically. We never hear her side of the story. We never hear questions that she's asking. We basically always hear sort of like monologue from the other side, even though from time to time it's clear that our protagonist has said something in the meantime. And so it's super interesting structure to begin with, but it also means that you have to kind of puzzle things together for yourself, kind of try to figure out what is happening, what is she trying to find answers to, because as I said, you don't know the question. You know that she's looking for some sort of an information, and throughout the book you will be figuring out what the question is, where the question is coming from. And I just thought it was fascinating. Such a fast-paced read, so compelling, and yeah, I loved it. Loved every minute of it. And then the final book that I'm going to be mentioning on here, another one of those clear-cut favorites for me, is An Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obioma. This is both a surprising favorite as an absolute favorite, because I read this in my goal of reading the entire Booker Prize shortlist. So this is part of the 2019 Booker Prize shortlist, and so I read it for that reason, but it was basically the book that was always kind of left out of the conversation when I was checking videos by people who making like predictions for who's going to win the Booker Prize and things like that. Nobody really talked about this book, and so I always just assumed that that meant that it was just like good but not great, or that it was just like the book that people loved the least. But I absolutely fell in love with this one. So in this one we are following a chicken farmer called Chinonso. Chinonso has always had a passion for chicken ever since he had like this encounter in his past that we will find out about later. And so he is living the life that he wants to lead. He has this small little chicken farm. It's sustainable for himself to be able to live the life that he wants to lead, and maybe even progress a little bit in his life over the course of time. However, at the very beginning of this book, he through chance meets up with this woman who is of a higher status within the society, and she is actually about to commit suicide. He helps convince her not to do so, and through this experience a bond ensues between the two of them. I think main criticism of this book that I didn't necessarily have this criticism, but when it was pointed out, I do think it's valid, is that that relationship between the two, it's just kind of assumed rather than that we're actually shown that there's real love between the two of them. And so, in any case, they form a relationship, but Chinonso really feels the disdain that's coming from her family. Her family is way higher in society than he is, and they definitely make it quite clear that they think he is too low for their daughter. And so the book is then very much about how Chinonso goes about trying to prove his worth to her family, trying to improve his life, to improve his circumstances in order to be worthy of her. And through doing that, he's taken abuse of quite a lot, and his circumstances actually go down from where they were. And so it's not just about the tragedy of seeing this innocent, happy boy and seeing where he ends up, seeing how he's taken abuse of by so many people, he's taken advantage of by the system a lot of times, but it's very much going to go so much beyond that, and it's so tragic to then see how he is transformed through the hardship that he goes through the circumstances that he goes through, how he becomes bitter, enraged, and how he's totally transformed, and at the end of the novel he becomes this very revengeful character. But so it's definitely a tragedy of looking at this character and his total transformation, his total downfall, and how he's so unrecognizable by the end of the novel in comparison to where he started out at the beginning. The structure of this book is also very interesting because we're looking at the story is told from the perspective of his chi, his guardian angel, and his guardian angel is basically making a case to the gods for why they shouldn't punish Chinonso for what has ended up happening. So from the beginning of the book we know something horrible is going to happen and that Chinonso is to blame for what has happened, but we kind of take the entire book to figure out what that exactly is. And so I actually know that a lot of people have problems with this book because they think that the author is trying to make excuses for what Chinonso does in the end. However, I definitely don't read it as that. I definitely think that yes, the guardian angel is trying to make a case for Chinonso, but yeah, the guardian angel can do nothing else. The guardian angel is basically his best friend, so to speak, so he has a very biased view. But also, if Chinonso is held to contempt for what has happened, that is also a reflection on the guardian angel's work. It also reflects on the fact that the guardian angel didn't do a very good job. But I think what the author is mainly just trying to show is how the world works against certain people, how the world and the systems in it work against people of a certain background, work against people of a certain color, work against people of a certain socioeconomical background, and how, you know, how difficult it is for a person like that to make its way up in the world. And so yeah, I absolutely love this one, and I think more people should be reading it. I definitely think there's so much in it to love, and I absolutely was intrigued by the writing style of this one as well. But so yeah, those were it. Those were my best books for 2020. I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know if you've read any of those books, what your thoughts were on them. If based on this you have a good recommendation for another book that you think would work very well for me, definitely let me know as well. Always on the lookout for amazing reads like this. And so yeah, definitely, as I said at the beginning of this video, there are a lot of books that are like just outside of this list that could easily make it onto this list at another day in time. But so yeah, these books have definitely made my 2020 a lot more bearable, and we definitely needed it in 2020. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video and see you guys for a future one. Bye!